So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the most common bookbinding tools, and these are also tools that you'll generally get in your kits, but there are different versions of them. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a bone folder. And there's lots of different kinds of bone folders, lots of different sizes, and they make them out of other materials as well. So the most common type of material is, you guessed it, bone. My suggestion is whenever you get a fresh bone folder, they're white like this. I immediately take them and I soak them in oil for about a day. Any kind of oil, I just use canola oil because it's what I tend to have around. Also, if you buy a bone folder, that's a part of one of my kits, I've already done this. And the reason that you soak them in oil is because the bone is a bit porous. And if you are using your bone folder with glue and glue gets on your bone folder, if you've soaked it in oil, it kind of slicks up all those porous parts of the bone folder, and so it doesn't soak up any of the glue. So it's really easy to clean a bone folder if you soaked it in oil. If you haven't soaked it yet, it'll stick way more and it might not even really come off. Another nice thing about having a bone folder made out of bone is you can actually grind this down into any shape. So if you want it to be super pointy or even have a curve inside, you can do that with, a Dremel tool or a sander. It does smell awful, just warning you. Bone folders aren't always made out of bone, though. The second most common material you'll see a bone folder made out is Teflon. I use my Teflon bone folder all the time. Really, the only difference between a Teflon and a bone folder is if you're doing embossing or debossing. If you use a bone folder, it'll sort of burnish the book cloth that you're rubbing down. So it actually kind of makes it shiny. You can see these marks where it's been rubbed down. If you use a Teflon folder, you don't get those burnishing marks. So I would suggest, if you're doing a lot of embossing and debossing, getting a Teflon folder, just so you know they are about 3 to 4 times more expensive than a bone folder. This is a bone folder. It's made out of plastic. I haven't even used it. I kind of was just curious what a bone folder from Amazon was like, and it's plastic. Don't do that. I have seen bone folders made out of wood. I don't know if there's any advantage or disadvantage to that. I kind of think they're pretty, which is fine. All right. You're going to use your bone folder for folding paper, scoring paper, and rubbing down any surfaces that you're trying to glue together. They're great for origami. They're great for making cards. Just a good tool to have in general if you ever do any kind of paper craft. The next tool that we're going to talk about is called an awl, and that is spelled with an A, so it's A-W-L. This is an awl from Talus Bookbinder. I love to use this one personally mainly for Coptic books because it's got a bigger head than the other awl that I use the most, but it's not huge. It's pretty similar to the awl that comes with my kits. This one is slightly bigger, which is also good for the Japanese stab binding to make those holes. This is one that's super similar to that one, but it is a bit fatter. I use this one sometimes, also from Talus. And then this is called a student awl. I actually love this awl. I know it's super cheap and it's like kind of flimsy, but I use this awl all the time because it makes a smaller hole than all my other ones, and my personal work tends to be rather small books. I'm also going to talk to you real quick about one more hole punching tool. This is called a Japanese hole punch, and it's got pretty much a spring in it. So you push down, and it has a spring mechanism, and it also pulls the material out. And then you can also change the head here for different sizes of holes. It's really good if you're poking a lot of paper down. Like if you're doing a really thick Japanese stab binding, it's pretty helpful. Also, it's good for book board. Personally, I've been a sucker for just using a hand drill or a drill press for poking holes. But this is a fun tool. So these are your hole making tools. All right, and the last big tool I'm going to talk to you about today is bookbinding brushes. So first I'll show you a couple of very, very traditional bookbinding brushes. These are also from Talus. They tend to have longer natural bristles. They're round and they're pretty flat on the end. This is because when you're using a brush for bookbinding, you're not going like this. You're actually working the glue up into the brush and then you poke down like this. This, it's called a chalk brush. I think it's for furniture painting, but it's very, very similar and it was much cheaper, especially considering how humongous it is. So if I ever have a need to make a gigantic book, I guess I'll try this chalk brush out. And then these are some smaller brushes. These are just stencil brushes. I actually use these pretty often just because I tend to work, once again, smaller. And then these are the brushes that I actually send out with my kit. I like these brushes because the way that you use these going down is very similar to how you would use one of these brushes here. So if you really love bookbinding, I would say invest in some brushes. You don't necessarily need to buy bookbinding brushes. There are also stencil brushes, chalk brushes like this one right here that are basically the same thing and much more much cheaper, not expensive. So most of the time when you're using these brushes, you're going to be using either PVA glue or wheat paste. When you're washing your brushes, use hot water. Hot water pretty much just will melt PVA glue off. If it's not fully set, using some hot water, you can save brushes. I would always have some water near you to put them in. You know, also a lot of places that big studios that I've worked at, if you're using a lot of glue, they'll pre-wash the brushes in a bucket to get most of the glue off, then finish washing the rest in the sink to save your pipes. So if you're using a lot of glue, I would go probably that route. I barely glue my books. I don't do a lot of gluing in my personal work. So I don't worry so much about it, but basically then they take the bucket, they leave it in the sun, it dries out, and they pull out the dried PVA glue out of the bucket so they don't have loads and loads going into their pipes, because that is not the best. So I hope you found this tutorial a little bit enlightening about the tools of bookbinding. In general, I buy my tools and a lot of my materials from Talas Book Supply. That's Talas. They're based out of Brooklyn. So if you live in New York City, you can actually go in person. And otherwise, they mail bookbinding supplies, at least throughout the United States. So these are the most common tools used for bookbinding. I will do a separate video on this tool right here. This is a book cradle. You can buy book cradles, but I've always just made mine. I'll make a video on specifically how to make a book cradle. And then just right here, this is a pretty standard bookbinding needle. It's just bigger than a regular needle, and it has a very dull tip because you don't want to be making your own holes as you're sewing. So they make it a dull tip so you can sort of move it around and then find your hole and go through. So those are the main tools that you'll use for bookbinding, with the exception of straight edges, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and then some kind of cutting instrument. I personally use a scalpel, and I also like utility knives and box cutters. You can also use X-Acto knives, anything that, you know, will do just fine. And then obviously a cutting mat is super helpful. You can use it to cover and protect your tabletop. When I was in bookbinding school in college, in my classes, it was too expensive to buy a bunch of these, so they just had a giant piece of bookboard to help protect the table surface. And there you have it. Those are the pretty standard bookbinding tools. Also, with most of my kits, you do get these tools as well, and they will serve you well for years to come.